My name is Burton Anderson. I was born in Salinas. I'm a grandson of pioneer immigrants to the Salinas Valley. My Swedish grandfather was a Swedish sailor on a Swedish merchant ship, sailed around the world as a young man. When he got to San Francisco, he decided the sailor's life was too much for him. They didn't get good food, it was terrible work, so he jumped ship, went to Angel Island, to be immigrated. And they asked him what his name was. He said, Evert Anders. They said, well, your name is Edward Anderson. So that's how he got his name, and that's how I got the Anderson name. Anyway, the paternal grandfather was Paul Tavernetti, who immigrated from Switzerland in the 1870s. He became a dairyman in Gonzales, and then the family started with him and Anderson. My grandfather was a sharecropper for David Jacks, raised barley in Gonzales. David Jacks was a canny Scotsman. He tried to grow potatoes in the Carmel Valley. He wasn't successful. So he decided to become a lender. And he realized that these Mexican rancheros were in trouble with their taxes bills. They couldn't pay it. So he'd lend them money. And exorbitant rates of interest, probably 18%. And when they couldn't pay off, he'd foreclose on the ranch. And at one time, he owned 60,000 acres in this valley. The Mexican era was a cattle raising era, and they raised cattle for their hides. They were slaughtered and left to rot, and there was no market for the meat. The only thing was worth anything was the hides, which were called California banknotes. They were dried and shipped by sailing ships to New York and the East Coast. That went on until California became part of the United States, when the gold rush happened. Then floodgates were opened for immigration, and Americans flocked to California by covered wagon through the Isthmus, Panama, whatever way they could get here. And so they began to squat on these ranchos. And the Mexican rancheros could not afford the taxes imposed by Monterey County in 1850. All they had was cattle. They didn't have any cash. So they had to come up with these property taxes, and they couldn't do it. So they had to sell, or subdivide and sell their ranchos. Agriculture started in the Salinas Valley, or the Central Coast really, in 1851 in Santa Cruz. They were raising potatoes and strawberries, and the reason was the gold had been discovered in California in 1848, and the miners needed food. And some enterprising Americans decided they better go get into the food business rather than dig for gold, which was problematical. So they started farming in Santa Cruz County. Pretty soon they moved into Monterey County and began farming in Monterey County in the 1860s. So the first crops grown were barley and wheat, up until the advent of irrigation, which was in 1898. It was spiked by Spreckels Sugar Company. Claus Spreckels built the factory at Spreckels in 1899 and drilled deep wells in the river bottom to supply the factory with water. And from that, irrigation began over the valley. The water table at that time was very high, and there were artesian wells in the Blanco district, and they were using that to irrigate barley and beets. When I was a kid, the Salinas River ran nearly all year, and it was full of quicksand. The reason was the water table was high, and it was liquid right under the surface of the sand, and kids had drowned in there. They get into the river bottom to hike or something, and they'd step in that quicksand, and down they'd go and drown. As the pumping started, the water table kept dropping, and so now there's no surface water anymore in the river. The first crops after barley and wheat were sugar beets and beans, and that was brought on by irrigation. That lasted up until World War I, and in World War I, there was a great demand for beans for the soldiers, and so the bean acreage increased from practically nothing to 32,000 acres in 1 year. Also at the same time, the dairy industry began, and really, I told you that my grandfather started a dairy in the 1880s and 90s, but there was no market for the milk. They couldn't haul the milk more than an hour or two away as it spoiled, so they made cheese. Anyway, the Jack's cheese business, there's 2 or 3 stories about that. But the one I think is most true is that it was an old Spanish or Mexican recipe. It started in Carmel Valley, and these people that made it, maybe the Barandas, I'm not sure, looked for a market for it because it was very popular. So he jumped in and said, I'll market it for you. So he started shipping it to San Francisco, and it became known as Jack Cheese. And that's the story, I believe. J.P. Meinberg invented the condensed milk. And that really set the dairy business on a profitable venture because they could condense the milk, they could have a market for their fresh milk. So that was a boon to the dairy industry. In the 1920s, Monterey County was the leading dairy county in the state. And it gradually went downhill from there. But at that time, it was a big deal. In fact, there was a Meinberg or Alpine milk plant in Salinas, as well as Gonzales and Soledad. Then, after World War I, the lettuce business began. It really began in Pajaro in 1916 when Mose Hutching planted 4 acres of lettuce at the urging of one of the seed companies. Lettuce had been grown in LA County and Imperial County since 1910, but not in the Central Coast. So he decided that he'd gamble. And he harvested 4 acres, shipped it to a Guerin company in San Francisco, and that started the lettuce business. But World War I interfered, and they didn't pursue it, not until after the war. And then in 1919, there was about 70 acres put in Watsonville. But then Ferrymore Seed Company had an experimental farm in the Salinas Valley, and they grew sweet pea seed. They told the farmers here that you ought to try lettuce because sweet peas and lettuce take the same climate. And so a group of them got together in 1921 and planted about 600 acres. And it was wildly successful. They made a lot of money on it. And that started the lettuce boom. In 1921, I think there was 70 cars, 1922, 500, and 1923, away it went. One thing that helped the lettuce business was the invention of the bunker ice car, which means they dumped blocks of ice into railroad cars and kept it cool en route to New York. Prior to that, all the lettuce had to be shipped locally. It couldn't cross the country. But with the invention of the bunker ice railroad car, it opened up a whole new vista of possibilities for the lettuce business. And by 1929, it was the leading crop in the Salinas Valley. Along with the lettuce, Tom Chesholm grew broccoli for D'Arrigo Brothers in 1921, I think. And D'Arrigo Brothers was in San Jose at that time, and so he had to ship it up there. But D'Arrigo saw the possibility of raising broccoli here and moved down here. And so they were the pioneers in the broccoli business. And then, of course, celery and carrots came later. The 30s were predominantly lettuce and broccoli and some celery. Then along came World War II, and that changed things drastically. The lettuce continued to be grown in World War II. It was under a price ceiling. So it was a steady thing. The country still needed lettuce. A lot of the crops went to Spiegel Foods, which had a dehydrator, and he dehydrated cabbage and carrots and that sort of thing for the troops overseas. And they preferred that to C rations or K rations. It was more palatable. In the 30s, all the lettuce was packed in lettuce sheds. It was cut in the field, loaded into wooden crates, hauled to the shed on trucks, and then trimmed and packed in crates and iced and loaded in rail cars. In the 30s, 100% of the lettuce was shipped by rail. After the war, a man by the name of Rex Bunzing invented what's called a vacuum cooler, which means that you put a pallet of lettuce in a tube, reduce it to a vacuum, and it draws the heat out of the lettuce, and it's a cooling without ice, which was a boon because it no longer needed ice to ship lettuce. You could cool it in the vacuum cooler, and you could eliminate the cost of ice. They reduced the size of the lettuce crate from 4 dozen wooden crate to 2 dozen fiberboard cartons. And the reason was a loaded lettuce crate of 4 dozen heads would weigh 120 pounds. And in the supermarkets, they didn't have many guys that could throw around 120-pound crates. So by going to half that many with a fiberboard carton, they were able to eliminate that problem. At the same time, it closed the lettuce sheds because they started packing in the field. And so the sheds were out of business. Along came the organic and the salad business. About 1990, or 1980 actually, the company I worked for began fooling around with it. And it was very difficult because they chopped the lettuce and put it in bags and shipped it, and 9 times out of 10 it spoiled en route. It took years of experimenting to get a bag that would not spoil the lettuce en route. They finally had to perforate it and use permeable bags that would breathe the air. If you cut the air off a lettuce, it'll spoil. So they put breathable bags in, and that really let the salad business take off. You can buy any combination of lettuce or vegetables in a bag. It's a big, big deal. The salad business is slowly taking over the #1 spot, except #1 crop in the Montgomery County or Central Coast is strawberries. Strawberries surpassed lettuce about 2 years ago as the #1 crop in the Central Coast. Lettuce is still #2. The salad lettuce business is #3, and it's going more and more to that salad type, convenient, ready package. Iceberg lettuce is not as big as it used to be. And the trend, it seems to me, is still going to more and more prepared foods. And it's taken a tremendous amount of effort and experimentation to get to where we are today. I was with the company that did this in the beginning, and we had lots and lots of trouble. In fact, we quit it for 2 or 3 years to regroup. The reason the Salinas Valley is so valuable, or the Central Coast, I can't miss Watsonville, is not the soil. There's good soil all over the world. People will tell you that it's the finest soil in the world. Well, I've been all over the world. There's fine soil everywhere. It's the climate. It's the climate here. As this valley, or our valley, the Salinas Valley, gets paved over, you're going to lose that climate. And when you lose that climate, you're going to lose the vegetable crops because they take cold weather, cool weather, which is only possible in the Salinas Valley and Parvo Valley, on the coast. And people don't realize that. They say, oh, you can grow it somewhere else. Well, you can't for 6 months of the year. You try to grow lettuce in Oklahoma City in the summertime. What are you going to get? My grandfather paid $100 an acre for his ranch in 1891. That ranch today is probably worth $50,000 an acre. If it could be subdivided, it'd be worth, who knows? But we don't want to subdivide it. It's a resource we can't replace. The controversy over what to do with this land is a big one. I hope that our supervisors will realize this and not allow subdivision on what's called prime agricultural land. There's plenty of land in the foothills and the marginal land to build on, but the prime agricultural land along the river in that area should be untouchable. But I realize there's a problem because in our own ranch, we get so much an acre per year. But if we could subdivide it, we'd all be rich, but we don't want to subdivide it, because we don't want to lose that resource. The problem is with the subdivision, it goes on to the climate zone that we need to grow cool crops, which is lettuce, broccoli, celery, and that sort of thing. Those are cool crops. It's not so much losing the land, it's losing the climate. Because if you put houses on it, it's gone. So what are you going to do when it's gone? You're going to have to move somewhere, Mexico or somewhere else. And that's not viable.